Hugely warm welcome to our panel today, and thank you so much for giving us your time. We'll hear in a moment first from Susie Brain England, who's the chair at Doncaster and Bassetlaw Teaching Hospitals, NHSFT, and was previously the chair of the South Yorkshire and Bassetlaw Acute Federation, bringing together the acute trusts in the area as well. And then we're going to hear from Angela Hillary, who's pivotal in her ICS and is Joint Chief Exec of Leicestershire Partnership NHS Trust and Northamptonshire Healthcare NHSFT. And then we're going to welcome Professor Stephen Ames, who's had a number of chief exec and system roles, but is currently chair and lead of the Humber Coast and Vale ICS, and from Cathy Elliott, who's chair of Bradford District Council NHSFT and part of the West Yorks and Harrogate Mental Health, Learning Disability and Autism Provider Collaborative. So we should get a range of perspectives from different trusts in different areas with different challenges and different models, and also from across quite a good spectrum of different services as well. Really important to say in NHS providers, we're going to be capturing the learning from across the sector. So that's across acute, ambulance, mental health and community collaborative arrangements as well. And for us, this is really core to our strategy. So this is the first of an initial series of 3 webinars, and we're going to be focusing quite fully on supporting you to implement provider collaboratives over the coming couple of years. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker, Susie, to give us her perspectives. And I think we're focusing on how the collaborative agreed its shared ambitions and made the case for change, and how you got that buy-in from across the staff and the wider community. So thank you, Susie, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to talk to you today. My plan is to give you a chair's perspective and to pose some questions, and I do apologise in advance if there are some minor exaggerations, just to make my point clear. When you look at matters from a chair's point of view, in addition to managing reputation, you're seeking to find new ways to enhance safety and patient experience, increase efficiency and effectiveness and value for money, fill all staff vacancies, and motivate the team to deliver all of the above. It is my belief that with the squeeze there's been on training budgets over the years, the only way to fill rotas, avoid high agency spend and have 0 vacancies is to seek to organise specialties across organisational boundaries within an ICS. With the years of cost improvement programmes which have used up all the recurrent savings we could safely manage in individual organisations, the only way to make further savings and deliver sustainable value for money is to find new ways of doing things across organisational boundaries. That is why 5 years ago, when I became chair at Doncaster and Bassetlaw Trust, I committed us to be the best partner anyone could have. Now today we talk about provider collaboratives as if they're an invention of the white paper and something new. However, it's the name that's new and not the concept. The wider health and social care partners in our ICS have been working together in groupings variously called federations, committees or alliances for some years. The CCGs work together, the GP federations and PCNs are now working together. The mental health and community trusts have been working together. We work together in a place partnership, the Doncaster Provider Alliance, and we have an acute federation, which started about 8 years ago as a project called Working Together. In working together, we thought of a number of specialist areas where collectively we would benefit from a change in how we delivered services. To give us a governance framework, we set on lawyers and all signed agreements giving us committees in common. However, what I say to you today is that the effort in arriving at secure governance arrangements has far outweighed the achievement in joint projects. After much deliberation, we agreed to vest hyperacute stroke in 2 trusts, but all 5 of us still offer rehabilitation, so the savings and efficiencies have not been as great as they might have been had we been brave enough to take the next step to reorganise rehabilitation. After many years and much talking, we are now at full business case for the first phase of a shared pathology service, which will save in the region of £6 million a year. With such savings to be made in an ICS, We should all be rushing to deliver joint schemes, but the pace has been slow, and this has been the learning point. Rightly, there's been a high level of clinical engagement, but as they say, turkeys don't vote for Christmas. There's been a reluctance to sign up for shared schemes, which might mean working differently on a different site or being part of a shared hierarchy where your role may not seem as senior as it did before. Indeed, I think that many of those engaged and consulted on proposed changes have feared job losses. And this is what I don't understand as we plan for partnership. There is simply so much work to do in the NHS, it is not likely that in key specialties, even with revised ways of working, that there'll be clinical job losses. I don't know about you, but if you add the growing waiting lists caused by pausing elective work through the pandemic, add those to the record-breaking attendances currently coming through emergency departments, and add those to the increase in referrals due to the higher demand coming through GP surgeries, then we're not going to be short of jobs, and we're not likely to see partnership working resulting in clinical job losses. Therefore, I believe our colleagues could develop a better taste for partnership working if they truly bought into the improvements in patient care it could bring us, and certainly the innovations and savings that will help us deliver safe and sustainable services long into the future. And this brings us to the key question of the day. Will provider collaboratives bring service improvements and save money? It will depend on how the duty to collaborate is policed and achieved. In our training, whether it be as senior leaders or clinicians, we have been encouraged to be competitive. We want to be the best at what we do individually. We want our team to be the best. We want our organisation to be the best. And indeed, in foundation trusts, we even put governors like Rottweilers on the gates to demand that we are the best and that we focus on our own patients. But the white paper and the future statutory requirements will demand evidence of collaboration, that we work together not just for the benefit of our own patients in our narrow geography, but that we work on population health, prioritising those facing the highest health inequalities, which may result in a neighbouring trust's patient taking priority over ours. How will that be policed and implemented? In my ICS, I see a rush to rename our federations, our associations as collaboratives. I see ideas being generated to create new collaboratives with defined outputs. But all, I think, have their eye on the money, because all the hints so far are that the load-bearing collaboratives will be the ones the ICS delegates funds to. Everyone is wanting to follow the money. So having said all this, my questions for you to consider are, if we've been working in partnership for so many years already and effected so little change and made so few savings, what will increase the pace of change if we call them provider collaboratives? If we've trained individual professionals across health and social care to be competitive, what will make them change their spots to collaborate in the new structures? If people are worried about their jobs and their status as we make change, how will we ensure that the NHS structural reform will truly give the patient a better deal with safe, sustainable and value for money services long into the future? How can we be sure the provider collaboratives will address health inequalities and improve population health?
Thank you, Susie. So some really thought-provoking questions to leave us with there at the end. So we're going to come back round to those. I'm not going to lose those questions. Really helpful. So Angela, if you're ready, we'll come to you next for your perspective, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Just to set the scene a little bit, it's important to share that we are in many collaboratives in Leicestershire Partnership Trust and in Northamptonshire. And just to give you a sense of that, of course, there's developments around the ICS, which I'll come on to talk about. but we're also part of an East Midlands alliance where we are lead providers in both instances around particular care groups on behalf of others in that East Midlands setting. And we're also in Northamptonshire part of collaboratives that exist around GP federations. So there is already a history and an intent that we've had around partnership working, which has, if you like, emerged a number of collaboratives for us. But what I wanted to do today was to talk more about the Northamptonshire ICS, where we are very much emerging a very strong mental health collaborative for the system, and to give you a little bit of the history, the current working, and also some other things that I think have been particularly important to us to have got us where we are. So in Northamptonshire, we have been meeting, we didn't call it a collaborative, but we have been meeting in partnership mode, I'm sure like many of you, for many years, because we've needed to deliver some of the care and the integrated care that we wanted to deliver together. And I think it's been, we look back now, we probably could track 5 years of working together. Now, the reason I mention that is because it's really important to share with you all that that has enabled a lot of trust to build up, a lot of ability to innovate together, because people have been coming together for some time. It's not something we've done just quickly. It's not something we've said, oh, there's a new ICS emergent, we should be meeting. It's something that did exist, but of course we've taken it to new steps more recently. Now, when we started, it was very important that we worked together, but we did it very much from a service user perspective. And I would again urge anybody to consider this and not to start with the governance, because this is clearly where it needs to start. And that would be our key recommendation to you all. And we did engage with people, because this is fundamentally what you collaborate for. And we did develop a series of what we call I statements, which were about people and what they conveyed to us they wanted. And they have been a guiding principle for all of the work that we've since developed on integrated pathways, but since developed in terms of emerging our collaborative at system level. Very, very important. Now, our partners around the table are vast. So there is a series, as you'd expect now, of governance mechanisms within our collaborative, but it includes all sorts of services, from primary care to education to public health to commissioning, provision. Obviously, experts by experience are implicit in every level of our collaborative. The important thing to say for us, and again, another key message is, we're not a provider collaborative, we're a collaborative. And I think that's, again, a fundamental difference that we have emerged in Northamptonshire and will similarly do in Leicestershire, because we believe very strongly that this is a collaborative that includes commissioners, because the collaborative can commission. So again, probably a fundamental difference to some that are emerging now. But where we've got to, having recognised what we've got, and of course behind all that, as I say, is governance structures now, work programmes, there's a depth to it. But fundamentally, our partners have recognised that this is the optimal delivery method, because we've delivered transformation to date, and we've delivered integration, and we have service users at the heart of it with an outcomes framework in place. So we've got a recognition now in our system that collaboratives will be our vehicle of transformation, and they'll sit at system level, and they will be used to undertake the transformation and be prepared to act on behalf of the ICS in that. So we are moving even further forward now into how that looks around contracts, and in Northamptonshire, I am in the development phase of an outcome-based contract for mental health, which again has been something that's been developing for some time, but is absolutely built upon what I've described earlier around an outcomes framework, what people have said they wanted, and clearly an alliance of partners who want, in my instance, our organisation to be the lead provider around that particular arrangement. Now, one of the things that we can say already that is important to share with you is, well, what does the collaborative do? And of course, it does all of the things you might expect around the long-term plan. But fundamentally, it allows us to co-produce pathway design. It allows us to give a strategic voice to service users. We can look at getting change done very quickly. We can accelerate. we can obviously support that integrated transformation that I've described. And we can also look at system impact, the analysis of things. And we're getting into topics that you would expect us to be only able to do together around things like housing, and employment will be another topic that we'll be looking at. So fundamentally, it is about working together, as Susie has said. It is about being ambitious for your population around population health. And it is about partners coming together in a formal sense and being allowed and empowered by their ICSs to be able to support the improvements. And what I can say is through that way of working, we now have a very clear view of the allocation for the mental health spend. We will be taking the opportunity to understand how we can advocate in the system for obviously using that resource. And we've taken steps already to commission the voluntary sector and left shift resources into them to sustain them, but also to make sure that we get the right services in the right place. So our crisis cafes, in particular, our supports around integrated crisis care have been very much supported by the voluntary sector. And clearly they are important partners with us. The final point I would say is that we have then brought all of our work streams together across agencies. So they're not just health. And we're able to see at any one point what people are doing in terms of those work programmes. And we have 3 pillars of work that are umbrella pillars for us that bring those things together. So to give you an example, we have one pillar around prevention, and we have people chairing those. And in this occasion, it is chaired by a chief exec in the voluntary sector. So we've tried to embed the partnership at every level. And the key message I would share is you need a quality of partnership. It's not about, even if you've got a lead provider arrangement, can you demonstrate equality of partnership around the table? You have to create trust. There's no doubt about it. Relationships do matter. You've got to invest in that. You've got to have service users and people, absolutely is the golden thread. And you've got to be outcome focused. And if you're not prepared to shift resources to the right place, then you need to question why you're even entering into a collaborative in the first place. So those are some key messages. I'll leave it there, Miriam, because I know that we need to get to the questions. Thank you.
Fantastic, Angela. Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up to the floor then for questions. So do post any questions that you have in the chat, or raise your hand if you can find that function, or just flag on screen to me. I'll kick us off. So I'm going to go back to those kind of thought-provoking questions that Susie sort of left us with there, which I think at the heart of that, Susie, is how we make that cultural shift, isn't it, over time towards a regime that's been very competitive to something that's really entirely different. And I think Angela had a few pointers there as to how they've approached it in her area. But Angela, I wondered if you wanted to pick that up in a little bit more detail for us in terms of how did you get that kind of mindset shift started, and then I'll come back to you, Susie, for a few further reflections, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think mindset is a really important point, because this is what it's all about. If people haven't entered into those types of partnerships before, mindset has to shift. But I think fundamentally the way that we did it was because we involved people from the beginning. So they were very clear, and we were able to demonstrate that even if people had organisational territory, this was the, if you like, the uniting piece, and it's kept us united, which I think has been important. And it's genuinely co-production, and it's not about just, a tokenistic approach to co-production. It is as real as you get. So I think that's really important to get the mindset shift. But I think the other thing is that you have to try to start on something, because again, if you work with the governance and you try to say, well, how are we going to work together, and you focus on the governance, you can get a brilliant governance structure and achieve nothing. So it is about actually what is it that you're trying to do, and can you make a difference together? And by doing that, I've found people are really motivated to want to do more. And of course, positivity breeds positivity, doesn't it? And then people say, actually, this is working, could we do that? And I'm really pleased to say that our collaborative in mental health is now being used as a blueprint for our collaborative for children and young people and our other collaboratives in our county, because it has been successful, but it's only because people wanted to work together and they came together around common problems.
Yeah, it's great. We hear that so often, that message of just make a start and it will kind of grow from there. Really interesting. Susie, did you want to add your reflections? And then I can see some questions are coming into the chat, so I'll pick up a couple from the chat.
Oh, yes, I noticed in the chat as well about co-production, and I think that in our certainly in our acute federation work to date, we have travelled hopefully, and there have been lots and lots of work streams. And I think you would probably describe those work streams as co-production, because they have engaged people to talk almost about projects, but across organisational boundaries, but within certain specialties, in order to try and deliver that more patient-centred deal with staffing crises, obviously achieve value for money. But I think we found after, in effect, a 2-year programme trying to review all of our a great number of our hospital services to see whether we could deliver them differently, we ended up back at square one, because what you found, or my interpretation of what we found, and I will say my interpretation of what we found, was that the teams and professionals involved ended up justifying why the current arrangements were adequate. Now, we don't just want adequate, we want exceptional, you know, we want transformation, we want, ultimately, we want services that will deal with those health inequalities, where in a way it's not just about your own patients from Doncaster, your own patients from Barnsley, your own patients from Bassetlaw, but it's about looking across the whole of the ICS region and saying that we have pockets of deprivation, we have poorer, significantly poorer health, significantly shorter lifespans in certain areas, and that will mean that we have to gear ourselves up, possibly to prioritise patients who come from a different geographic area, and that's proved very hard to culturally get down, let's say, to the shop floor.
It is a big cultural shift for people, isn't it? And linked to that, I guess there's a question in the chat about how are you then led in how resources are allocated and prioritised? So I don't know if you can provide a bit more depth around that, Susie, and we can ask Angela as well, because it sounds like resources have shifted in her system a little bit.
I think we've tried to do that with capital monies, that the ICS became responsible for capital and sought to prioritise. And I would be so bold as to say my personal experience was having prioritised, certainly where there was a great deal of backlog maintenance, we needed new build and renovation and investment, that actually when it went into the centre, there was political interference, so that the prioritisation across the ICS shifted to primary care and over and above acute and mental health trusts and any other parts of our economy. As a result of which, personally, in my trust, we experienced a leak and explosion, which has now left me with 50% of a women's and children's building unoperational, because that had been prioritised, and then the political will to deliver to primary care as a priority meant us left off the list, and that is the result. You know, so I think we've got a long way to go to understand where the power sits, because if it is going to be in the ICS, it needs to be in the ICS, and it needs to be an honest appraisal of where the danger zones are, because we all sit with responsibility on sovereign boards. So I go to jail for corporate manslaughter, you know, it's the health and safety executive that'll come after me and the chief executive. And yet the ICS might have prioritised that my capital schemes that saved me from jail were not completed. And I think that's a real risk for us all going forward.
Yeah, there's a lot to be worked through, isn't there, in terms of the white paper and the bill. Angela, did you want to add to that in terms of how your system and collaborative has managed to move resource around? Because that was one of your key lessons, wasn't it? So yeah. I wonder what drove that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, first and foremost, I think that because people wanted to work together, that most certainly helped. But we also, as a trust, had to be able to be prepared to be innovative. So if we look back at our trust board, we had discussions about our risk appetite, and we clearly wanted to be innovative, and we took an ability to put resources into the voluntary sector without knowing whether it was going to be effective or actually it was the right thing to do. but we did it in a small way to prove concept. Then if you tie that in with the fact then service users were telling us they wanted more of that crisis cafe experience, and we worked in partnership to develop that experience and that pathway with our third and voluntary sector, it became abundantly clear that more of it was needed. And we were then able to scale, and if you like, the case for change was made, because we recognised people wouldn't accept the shift initially. And I think that's important, is that, you know, it's quite scary to move resources because people are worried about what does that mean for their organisation. But if you do have a really truly person-centred approach and you're prepared to try things, and you've got organisations that are prepared to be innovative, then I would encourage people to try things and then look at what can be adopted and scaled, and not try to do everything all at once, too big at once, would be my view.
Really helpful. So the questions are coming in thick and fast in the chat. So I think we'll ask one more now, but we won't lose these questions. We'll pick some of them up in the panel at the end as well. So I guess building on what you've just talked about, Angela, in terms of starting smaller, there's an interesting question from Ben around sort of choice of model. So he's saying, you know, have you or Susie got any learnings or experience around the choice of model between, say, the more extreme merger option, which is really interesting for Northamptonshire, isn't it, versus going for something that's more of a hybrid or a group model / committee and common. I don't know if you can give us some thoughts on that.
Yes, certainly. So my particular experience, and we are in a group with Leicestershire Partnership Trust and Northamptonshire together now, and I would say that, you know, we chose not to go merger because actually it would have really been a big distraction and not necessarily achieve what we wanted at all. We took a very similar approach to our ICS mental health collaborative. What are we trying to do? Let's just work together. Let's see if there's mutual benefit. Let's create a climate where people can work together. And naturally, people then wanted to continue the relationship. And we decided that a committee in common group would be a way to do that. But at the same time, the boards wanted to make sure organisational identity was retained, which is what a group gave us. Because if we'd said a merger, I think people would just run away, and we certainly wouldn't have achieved the outcomes we've got. I mean, I think we've got now a very, very good structure for quality improvement across both organisations. Nobody feels threatened by it. There is a common place to come together to understand what we could do differently and add value. And it is literally, again, about improvement and outcomes, not about territory.
Yeah, that's such an important message, isn't it? And Susie and Doncaster Law, it sounds like you've had groups and forums to bring providers together rather than looking at sort of harder structural options. I don't think have been on the table. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And it is true that if you ever mention the merger word, it does set the hairs running. And clearly, because in South Yorkshire we are a wholly foundation trust economy for mental and community health and for the acute sector, then we have governors who wish to protect our individual organisations. But I think what we haven't thoroughly explored, you know, what mergers do in many private sector organisations is they result in value for money savings on the big picture items, certainly the back office functions, administration, computer systems, that investment in digital, possibly HR and even estates, you know. And I think while I focused quite a lot on the clinical gains that could be achieved from provider collaboratives, we mustn't lose sight of the value for money needs that we have to all achieve. And whether it's called a merger, whether it's called working together, or whether it's called sharing services, I think we have to look at HR, at estates, at back office functions, at digital, to see how the wider footprint of an ICS can bring us those value for money savings.
Really helpful, thank you. Let's actually just squeeze in one more question before we invite Stephen to give his presentation. So I'm just going to pick up on Matt's question around: have service users seen a demonstrable change from the efforts of collaborative working? I don't know if that's one, Angela, you want to come in on initially, because you talked a lot about building outwards from the service user perspective.
Yes, I mean, most certainly. I mean, one of our other pillars is that acute crisis support, just to share. But yes, I mean, what people said they wanted was more flexible crisis support, when they needed it. So crisis cafe is now in place 7 days a week across our county. They wanted to see crisis houses in place when they needed them, those sorts of things. That was what they wanted. They wanted to stay close to home. So in Leicestershire, for example, we've got 0 out of area placements. So those sorts of things, absolutely, they're telling us what they mean to them, and they absolutely recognise that everything we've done in transformation is about them. So I have no problem sharing that. They really do recognise, and they continue to work with us. So it's equal partners. It's not us doing to them. It's actually, what do we emerge from the collaborative?
Fantastic.
And indeed, Miriam, the example I gave about hyperacute stroke, then the benefit to the patient has been measurable and extremely important. I actually believe there's a very long list of specialties where patients would fare better and we get better outcomes if we were brave enough, bold enough, could move faster to look at working across organisational boundaries and building our teams bigger. And we're asked to build back better as a country. We can build back better post-pandemic by working collaboratively, but people have got to stop being frightened of their job and think about the service user, the patient at the end of the day.
Thank you. That is the thought to keep front and centre in our mind, isn't it? So thank you very much, Susie and Angela. We'll, if you stay with us, we'll perhaps bring you in for a few more reflections in the panel at the end. But thank you ever so much for really thought-provoking presentations and remarks. So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Stephen Ames. Stephen, we did introduce you at the start, but Stephen's chair and lead of the Humber Coast and Vale ICS with considerable experience of chief exec and other system roles on his CV as well. And after we've heard from Stephen, we'll hand over to Kathy Elliott, chair of Bradford District Care NHSFT. So Stephen, if you're ready, are you okay to give us your perspective?
I am. Nice to see you, Miriam, and good afternoon to everybody. Yeah, so I will address myself to the 3 questions, but just very quickly for 30 seconds to orientate it. Our provider collaboratives are developed in a whole system approach and design that's been going on for about 3 years. It's obviously picked up pace in recent times, and especially with the more recent design framework guidance. We've got 4 sector collaboratives. And we really built our approach from the mental health and learning disability collaborative that's been in place the longest. We have an acute collaborative, a primary care collaborative that splits into 2 halves, actually, because of the size and geography of our particular ICS. And I think somewhat uniquely, a community and care collaborative. Which brings me to the other contextual point, is we've had strong engagement from local authorities all the way through the process. Clearly, it's a very important part of our principle that we're working with in terms of equal partnership with local authorities and the VCSE. All of that's been supported by a development programme. There's been about 6 to 7 sessions so far, and that's going to continue throughout this year. So in terms of shared ambition, there's more work to be done, but we're working in that whole system way under the ICS vision, which is in essence to help our citizens, our people, to start life well, live well, age well, and end life well. And I think we all I think are probably familiar with the 4 principal aims of ICSs, which essentially are partnerships. Despite some of the legal framework that's coming, then we're focused collectively, whether we're place-based integrated teams, the ICS or provider collaboratives, on improving outcomes, tackling inequalities, enhancing productivity, and playing our part in the broader social and economic development. Now, this is unfinished business, but just to make the point that the development and the visioning around collaboratives falls out of that. Now, we have derived from local discussion and engagement some simple focused priorities for this year. So for community and care, they're around discharge to assess policy implementation, aging well, and actually working closely with our primary care collaborative on PCN development. The acute has essentially focused largely on recovery, and that's largely on waiting time recovery. That's a top priority for our system as others. They are doing other things, but that's their number one priority as determined by themselves. And in mental health, the focus is on learning disability and autism, and particularly on some aspects of supporting the broader operational recovery, so mental health into emergency care and so on, that we're all faced with. So very practical activities. In terms of buy-in, again, more work to do, but we've been working with some principles which have been developed across the partnership. So we've had voluntary sector, we've had local government member and officer input to what I'm just going to quickly run through. So first of all, form should follow function. That's particularly, I think, important in the context of the potential silo issues and other issues that flow out of the way that we're organised in the sector on a sector basis. I'll come back to that under lessons. Adding value, the last thing that I think our collaboratives want to do is add pressure in the complexity of system working. There's a calibrating consistency. In other words, one of the benefits of working collectively in collaboratives is about standardization, particularly of clinical pathways, for example. But we've got this term, but recognized defensible localism, bit of a mouthful. But in other words, local variations allowed. I just heard some other colleagues talking about this, a creative platform for shared learning. We've all got, I mean, nationally, and certainly in some of, particularly in some of our areas in Humber Coast and Vale, a collective commitment to reducing inequality. And we know, for example, if you look at our acute waiting lists, some of that exists already in the backlogs that we're dealing with. We've got a principle about democratic legitimacy that I'll come back to. And I touched on this, but simplicity and clarity as much as possible is the other thing that we're driving for. I think the last and probably most important piece of a principle linked to buy-in is recognizing that the primacy of the action of provider collaborative should be focused on organizing care at the most appropriate level. So that starts with population, back to patient, through community to place, and so on. So on to lessons. Well, behaviors and mindsets, really important to pay a lot of attention to that. That is a big part of the ongoing work that we're doing. I should have said at the beginning that we also have a forum that I'll touch on in a second, which is all the providers coming together in a collaborative of collaboratives as part of our development work and forming the ICS towards a legislative model this year. All our trusts and collaboratives are wrestling with something, I think it might have been Susie or somebody said this, sovereignty of governance, etc., and collaborative accountability and sovereignty. I don't think we've got all the answers to that question. I mentioned this, avoiding silo working. And one of the things that we've tried to do while sticking with that principle around simplicity is, the acute collaborative is built from the acute organizations, but there are other voices in there from the other sectors in order to make sure that there's a broad and rounded discussion of all the issues that they're dealing with. I think there's a really big issue for us nationally and locally about, teasing out what's going to happen at place and what's going to happen in collaboratives. And that raises that issue of democratic deficit. So what local councils say to me is, well, how do we hold these provider collaboratives to account? And they're responsible, if they're working together, let's say with a common waiting list, to us through overview and scrutiny and other mechanisms in terms of our citizens in our place. Now, there's a lot to be done on working that through and building trust. There's also a set of issues that link to how we're shifting through the transition from the old system to the new and the deployment of resources. So collaboratives need to have the capacity to operate. If you're a large acute organisation spanning 6 places, that's pretty challenging. So how can we support collaboratives to function effectively in a number of different dimensions? And then my last point, hopefully keeping to time, is we've long had a principle and a practice in our ICS around distributed leadership. So in other words, the leaders of the collaboratives are the leaders of the ICS. It's one and the same thing. And we apply that principle. So when I talk about discharge, for example, policy being in the community and care collaborative, that's work on behalf of the whole ICS. And there are people from different parts of the system commissioning as well as providing, working in that agenda. So hopefully I've kept to my 8 minutes, which is a real challenge for me. And back to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Stephen. And really rich remarks there. There's a lot for us to get our teeth into there. I'm going to invite Kathy to give us her perspective now, and then we'll come back round for some questions. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you, Miriam. So as Miriam explained, I'm chair of Bradford District Care NHS Foundation Trust, but I'm also the current chair of the Provider Collaborative for West Yorkshire and Harrogate, and that's for mental health, learning disability and autism services. And I think one of my colleagues, Angela Monaghan, is also here from South West Yorkshire Partnership. So we cover a population in West Yorkshire and Harrogate of about 2.3 million. Our Provider Collaborative goes across 5 local authority areas, 5 CCGs and 4 trusts that specialise in these services. So the Provider Collaborative has been set up since 2018. It has a very sound memorandum of understanding and a very collaborative and collegiate way of working. But that is because, and Stephen, actually you touched on this, is that we are a coalition of the willing. We are the ICS, and my colleague Angela, who's here today, talks very strongly about this. You can't blame upstairs ICS. You are the ICS. If there's a problem, we've got to solve it together. What we've done over those since 2018 is looked at ways in which we can improve services and transform services together. And that very much has had service users in mind and involved as well. And we've had to make some brave decisions together as 4 trusts about consolidating services, closing services, changing services, working out who is going to be the lead provider. And when I've talked about provider collaboratives before, it's a really simple way of putting it, but sometimes you win some and sometimes you lose some, but you're in a collaborative and working together to do the best thing by your population and your local residents and service users. So we have a number of work streams that are about, and service transformations about to go live. One is assessment treatment unit for people with learning disabilities. One is tier 4 CAMS. Another one is forensic services. And we're working together to make sure that they're the best offer that we can provide across our 4 services. But the other area in which we're working is actually trying to explore and embed common practice. And I'll put up in the chat in a minute that actually NHS Providers has written up our Provider Collaborative and our learning since 2018, which we really appreciate. But particularly we're looking at prevention of and management of violence and aggression. So we've got senior leaders together across the 4 trusts to look about the ways in which they work together. It's interesting how 2 trusts do it one way, 2 trusts do it another way. But if we truly want to passport staff across different services and different sectors within our ICS, there needs to be common ways of working, down to the point that we find it's interesting for us as chairs and chief execs on our Provider Collaborative and the committee in common we're part of, that actually sometimes people, when they're being restrained or supported, sometimes go that way, sometimes go that way. We don't need to get into the detail of it. What it is the spirit of people wanting to work together to try and find common ways of working that work for both our workforce and for our service users. Now, for us within our ICS, it's not, I'm trying to explain this with just my hand, but it is not hierarchical. We are a coalition of the willing. We have our ICS, we have our 5 places, and we are working through together how the provider collaboratives aligned with the guidance, but also how it works for us in West Yorkshire and Harrogate with specialist services that need to plug in at ICS and at place level. And we're working that through at the moment. And I know people have talked about the governance can't come first, but we've also got to kind of build it and develop it as it goes along. And particularly, what is the role of the provider collaborative on the statutory ICS board as it comes into play in spring next year? So right at the beginning, there was a challenge from Susie about what will change. I think for us, actually, we're at a really key moment, which whether the white paper came out or not, we're about to transform services together and therefore see in practice how that works, and then answer that question about, has this worked in practice for service users? But I think from my point of view, there's something we've worked on together in the last 12 to 18 months or so about speaking with one voice. And I think we've got greater confidence in working together, particularly ensuring that people with learning disabilities have a better experience in our services, and then to collectively make sure that we're benchmarking our own services and also challenging our colleagues in other parts of healthcare, particularly acute services, who have a completely different attitude most days on how they deal with people with learning disabilities. So for us, we work well to plug in with the ICS, and we have 10 clear strategic aims, and one of which is about ensuring the life expectancy of people with learning disabilities is extended. But also when we have to manage in that provider collaborative, how you have that oversight of the commonality, take that prevention and management of violence and aggression training to the strategic aim of improving services for people with learning disabilities. So our provider collaborative is built on trust, it's built on good relationships, it's built on all the things that I love about the Nolan principles and how you work together. But also we have to have both the formal meetings as well as the informal discussions to work through things together. So that's an overview, and I'll put a link into the chat box so people can have a look at a write-up from NHS providers. But what I would say is this is a great opportunity to share best practice. We're different sizes as provider collaborative, different approaches, different people. Sometimes people say when you've seen one ICS or one provider collaborative, you've only seen one. What we do have is a lot of common ingredients here that I'm really pleased that NHS providers are bringing us together to sort of learn from each other in terms of best practice. And frankly, to take the pick and mix of what's available there to make sure that alongside the guidance that's coming through, we can deliver the best collaboratives we can, which in turn delivers the best services that we can. So that's an overview from me, and particularly some highlights from that write-up. And as I said, I'll put that in the chat box now. Thanks, Miriam.
Fantastic, Kathy. Thank you. Really motivational, and thanks for the plug for our Providers Deliver report, which, as Kathy says, writes up her trust experiences and a number of others. So we will definitely circulate that full length with full link with the notes of this session as well. So more questions, please, in the chat for our speakers. I was actually going to come back also as there's a comment in the chat around that kind of balance between complexity and simplicity. And I was actually going to ask a question around that actually. And Stephen, I think it was one of your principles to be as kind of clear and simple as is possible in engaging people. And I just wondered what your reflections on achieving that balance are, given that you've got some quite complex partnership arrangements at different levels of population going on. So any kind of reflections on cutting through such that the arrangements are sufficiently clear and simple? Stephen, do we want to come to you first, and then we'll ask Kathy for her thoughts?
Couple of thoughts on that. So this might sound a bit trite, but if we were sitting here in 15 months' time, there's the ICS and there are providers. I think that's quite helpful to think about it in that way. So just reflect that back in we've got a massive geography, one of the biggest geographies in ICS terms in the country, and they're very diverse politically and lots of other ways. There's not a lot in common between Harrogate and Hull, let me tell you. And so what we are trying to do with this is to basically say, when we get to the final position and a greater definition about all the things that we're doing, including our provider collaborative framework, we want to be operating on that simplistic basis. So whilst we've got two partnerships, strategic partnerships in the Humber, linked to local government, and the same in North Yorkshire and York, linked to local government, they're not tiers of or bits of bureaucracy in the ICS. They're arms of the ICS, arms of the same partnership. So again, that's a sort of a way of thinking about this. So that's I guess the first point I'd make about governance. The second thing is, all we've done with our collaboratives is agree a vision, agree a statement of intent, agree a set of terms of reference, and agree a set of priorities. I alluded to at the beginning of my presentation. And we're going to leave it at that for the time being, and we'll style the nature of the governance in concert with what our overall governance arrangements are going to be, taking account of our 6 places and the wider ICS. Back to you.
Thank you. Kathy, how does that look from your perspective, getting that sort of balance?
I think it's tough for all of us, whatever kind of community or population you're working with. I think we have to remember that place is the primary place. It's the primary point of power, and I mean power as in the driving engine of delivering the right kind of services. And then my point about the specialist services, like our provider collaborative, and we have one for acute services as well, wraps round. And I was talking to some ICS colleagues this morning about their job is about enabling. So if the place can't do it, or there's a commonplace problem, I don't know, workforce, for example, then how does the ICS play a role as an enabler and is a servant to the place? And how does the provider collaborative plug in? And I think we've got to work it out together. But when you're a coalition of the willing and you've got trust and you can have open, challenging conversations, then you can try and move forward. I think it was a point I particularly wanted to make about, we've worked really hard, particularly as the 4 chairs as part of our provider collaborative, to bring people with us. And our ICS team supports us every 6 months to brief our governors and our non-exec directors. Really simple thing, but just take a morning to brief them and keep them up to date, because at some point there's going to be a key sign-off. And Angela, I know is listening, that there's a point there where we together as chairs have to take to our governors and our boards, signing off new opportunities. And so by taking people with you, briefing them, enabling them to understand and enable them to switch their mindset from place to provider collaborative to ICS. I'm not being patronising in any way. This is complex for all of us. That then they can come with you and understand the benefits of it, rather than having this insular silo, perhaps reaction that sometimes people have. So, and there's been great benefit and great learning from by bringing those governors particularly with us.
Really helpful. And just flipping back to our wider panel, Angela, I wondered if you wanted to add anything around that sort of place dynamic and I suppose the relationships with local government, just thinking of your recent experiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you say, I know every ICS is so different in terms of its own complexity, but fundamentally how we're doing it, we've had good engagement from local government in both systems, so that's a good thing. And we're using that local government footprint to be the sort of, if you like, delivery around place. So the collaboratives are, if you like, system-wide, but delivery is in place, because actually that's the point at which we can look at different needs, the point at which we can understand if outcomes are being met, and the point at which we can make a difference together if we need to and should be. So I think that's the way we're looking at it. But of course, the other important point is we can also get distracted by those footprints, because really place is about somebody's home. And we need to be able to be agile enough to be making a difference for people, not just the boundaries that we naturally now refer to as place. So that's something, again, we've got to keep very close to. But yeah, the local authority footprints, the unitaries, 3 local authorities in Leicestershire, 2 unitaries in Northamptonshire are what we will be using fundamentally to look at where delivery is, what it's making to local people's needs.
Really helpful. And at the other, Susie, did you want to come in there on the kind of governor angle in terms of engagement? And then we've got a question at the other end of the spectrum about cross ICS working, which I'll come to. But Susie, you're very close to kind of governor issues and support us in our work with governors. So what are your thoughts on engaging them?
That's right, Miriam. I do sit as the NHS Providers Board representative on the Governor Advisory Committee, which is a national committee of governors. And so I hear firsthand from governors across the whole of England what they feel about the way things are turning out, but also with my own governors. And as I said earlier, in South Yorkshire, all of the trusts are foundation trusts. So we've got about 350 governors between us if you add it all up. And certainly I started the ICS journey saying to colleagues that I felt that we needed to engage governors and non-exec directors from the beginning, and indeed led some conferences for governors and non-exec directors so they could be talking about what joint working looked like and how collaboration and working together and what it would mean for them. Because I think ultimately it is going to be a hard choice for governors, because they think they're elected to protect services in our sovereign organisations. But ultimately we'll be asking them to sign up for greater shared working, possibly without changing their role or their job description. And I haven't heard anybody yet describe to me or seen in any of the documentation what the plan is to give governors a say at ICS level, and to say how are we going to stop them blocking change, which they possibly could do, because they've been sufficiently engaged and motivated to see the benefits of working together. So I think there's a whole raft of work still needs to be done in relation to governors, and just setting up citizens panels is not enough. Just using Health Watch or professional patient groups, that's not enough, because governors feel they're elected to do a job and they'll try to do it, and we have to make it easy for them to buy in to the collaborative approach.
I think that's absolutely right about making it easy for them to buy in, isn't it? And we know that NHS England is preparing some updated guidance for governors, which sort of sets their current statutory role in this different system context. But nonetheless, it's not a straight read through, even with that extra support to help people interpret their role slightly differently. It's still quite a big ask, I think, particularly for governors that have got a number of years of experience. So really good point. Stephen, just while we're on sort of engagement and thinking about how we engage communities more broadly, I don't know if you wanted to come in there and tell us a bit about how you approach that in Humber Coast and Vale.
So specifically in relation to collaboratives as opposed to in other ways, I mentioned in the presentation that we've got local government engaged in two ways. So we've got officers from local government from each of our 6 places in the development work and design of collaboratives, and that's our conduit in terms of how we feed back and exchange information, potentially co-produce with some really innovative thinking and ideas from that source. That's one way we've done that. The other way is the ICS in overall terms has had a relatively long-standing chairs and members group. So that's the non-executive chairs of the provider organisations. I might also say we've got 3 really quite important social enterprises in our patch that form part of that. And members, often health and wellbeing board chairs, but not exclusively in that group. So we've been testing some of what I briefly touched on routinely as part of the wider operating framework for the ICS. Now, having said all of that, I think we're not very well developed on the broader engagement. So you start to talk about people in communities and start to say, well, the acute collaborative's doing this. I'm not sure they know what you were talking about. So it's there is a whole, and I think that's a microcosm of a bigger challenge for ICSs, which is how do you translate all this stuff into something meaningful for the nurse on the front line, or the person in the street. So that's sort of where we're at the moment.
Helpful, thank you. And I just don't want to lose this question in the chat from Andy about working across ICS boundaries. So this is sort of flipping to the other end of the spectrum at real scale. But can I invite any member of the panel to talk about that, how you're managing that kind of cross ICS boundary working? So the question's around acute services, but it applies across mental health and LD as well. Any thoughts on that, Angela?
Yeah, I can say, I mean, obviously, in Leicestershire and Northamptonshire, there are separate ICSs. So the mental health collaborative that I've described is collaboratives that exist in both of those ICSs, so they are separate. But our East Midlands collaborative, which is all of the mental health trusts in the East Midlands footprint and some independent providers, like St Andrews Healthcare, is also a collaborative. And of course, we span many ICS footprints in that arrangement. Now, what we've got is a very clear formal mechanism, an integrated governance, if you like, intention, which is in its development stages. We've become lead providers, so there's clarity about the gateways we've had to go through to if you like, sign off business cases to be able to become lead providers. So there's a sort of a formality to it. And clearly there is a lot of arrangements that sit behind that are clear about the roles we've got. But fundamentally, again, we have also met pretty much weekly as chief execs through COVID in particular, to build our relationships and think about how we can support each other. And that's led to, outside of that formal mechanism, a whole raft of different collaborative learning events that we've been able to introduce for our staff, etc. So whilst we are in different ICS footprints, we've tried to, again, keep a very clear focus on how do we make a difference together, and how do we add value, and how do we think about not, being any sort of, in any way, territorial to each other, but how do we actually add that value and learn and collaborate together. I have to say it's been a really joy to be part of, at the same time as having formal leadership arrangements that we have to be held to account to. So it's been a great experience, to be honest, and I would really recommend that sort of ability to work across the ICS footprint. And the one thing I would say that we've done as a part of that is we have then established and commissioned between us a demand and capacity tool that didn't exist for mental health. It's allowed us to now look at all of our data together. We've shared it, and we can scenario plan, and we can look and understand what it means. Again, in the past, we probably wouldn't have chose to share our data. We've done it. So there are great examples from it. I would really encourage people to do it.
Fantastic, thanks, Angela. And Anna has had a hand up. Sorry, Anna, I'd missed that. So do you want to come in with your question? You might be on mute, Anna. Yeah, I think you're still on mute, Anna. Sorry, the mute button's at the bottom left corner. That's it.
Yeah, for me, I'm on an iPad, which is a bit of a mess. Anyway, sorry, I've done it now. Apologies for that. Yeah, one of my questions was in the chat, but I think it might have got lost at the top somewhere. So I'll repeat that one. I just wondered, I think it was Susie who first mentioned some of the concerns that clearly we've experienced in our system, and I'm sure are very common, around the anxieties of staff and the hierarchies of staff and how they perceive their positions and how they might be perceived within any kind of collaborative or group model. And I just wondered whether any of the speakers, all of them in a sense, have actually seen, because you're a bit further ahead than perhaps we are in this whole journey, whether you have actually seen an exodus of senior staff, i.e. executive or senior clinicians, who have thought, I'm not going to wait around to see what happens, I'm just off. Because that's very much has been a very loud concern from some of the members of our system. And the other one, which is sort of linked, is in terms of individual organisational performance. And we're all foundation trusts, but we're a good trust, but not all of the trusts are in the same position. And again, there's a focus sometimes within those individual trusts around, well, we need to sort out, what's happening in our trust first before we can spare the energy to collaborate. And again, my particular perspective on this is that actually collaboration is one of the routes out of that, because you're helping to solve some of the problems collectively. But I just wondered whether that had been experienced, that sort of resistance had been experienced anywhere else, and how others had overcome that. So,
really good questions. Thank you. Susie, should we come to you first, especially on that sort of staffing and motivation point?
Yes. I think I don't have a precise answer, but I have a few thoughts, because you only had to read the papers this week, and the Chancellor looking at raiding pensions again, potentially. Now, we've only just recovered from consultants who were in difficulties with lifetime and annual allowances, and were refusing to do extra work to help us deal with waiting lists. That was pre-pandemic. So we're already now going to face the fact that the pensions argument might drive people to pack it in early, or certainly not do any extra work. We know that people are tired, exhausted, fed up through COVID, and so people are looking to retire early if they can, or move to a more gentle job. I think it is evident that in things like the pathology work, people did leave partly because of the potential risk in hierarchical terms to the status with which they were perceived, but also just change. You know, some people just think they're not going to be able to cope with change. And when all's said and done, so much of what we're talking about changing the way that we do things, we still don't know whether that's backed up with enough funding to have, say, new equipment or new estate. You know, so we're kind of trying to put new shoes on an old model, aren't we? And, you know, ultimately, service transformation will mean root and branch transformation, not just asking the people to work differently, but giving them the tools and the environment with which to work differently. All of that's a great unknown, and these are the things that send people looking for pastures new.
Thanks, Susie. Kathy, I don't know if you might want to come in there, because you did talk about sort of motivating staff and getting them on board quite a lot as well in your kind of remarks. And I suppose picking up Anna's second question there as well about that balance between a board seeking to sort out, I think what was Anna's phrase, the trust, versus seeing collaboration as a route out of some of the challenges.
Anna, yeah, I mean, I suppose in responding, because we're a coalition of the willing, and please don't think it's all peace and hippies going on in our provider collaborative, but there is a sense of working together that, and let's be honest, we're short-staffed across all services, but actually the opportunity of working together and shared ways of working is really welcomed. I've just put in the chat box something we've done together around health and wellbeing for staff in response to COVID, and that's anyone. You don't have to be an NHS worker, you might be a council or voluntary sector worker. So I feel like I suppose it's the opposite. I think it's tough. I mean, you know, sitting in our provider collaborative, we're very open to be open. We're a trust that's rated requires improvement. We're on our way to good. And, you know, something like an inspection happens and you got to down tools and you get your head down, don't you? And then, and I mean down tools in the ICS work, but I think there are ways in which you can evidence. For example, take the assessment treatment unit transformation. We can prove by working in partnership, our own ATU is going to improve, which then enables to keep our regulator happy. So I think it's trying to understand and then sell the benefits. I think we've still got to work practicalities out, how people are admitted and discharged across our services together and what's the common approach. I know that sounds really obvious, but trying to make sure that flow works well. And understanding each other's bed capacity, for example, practical things to try and support each other. But I think what we see in our trust is that there are benefits in working in partnership and in a selfish way that helps us meet regulator requirements. But actually, the ultimate aim we have is improving our patient care and work with our communities. So, and genuinely, I mean that. Genuinely, we've got to have tough conversations to make it happen, to improve those services.
Thanks, Kathy. And I'll come to Stephen next, and then perhaps Angela, and then I will have to summarise in record time because we'll be against time. But Stephen, over to you.
I'll be as brief as possible. I think Anna's question is really important, and it's the zeitgeist, actually. And the NHS is committed, clearly through the people plan, to its people. But the reality is, if we look at ourselves, we aren't necessarily handling that well at the moment for significant cohorts of staff in CCGs and those already work for systems. So it's in that context I make, just reflecting on your question, I think it's really quite important to be clear, even with that environment, and we understand why it is, to be with all staff, what the future looks like. And I think there are 4 locations: the ICS, provider collaboratives, place for the majority of people who work in place currently, but maybe doing different things, and local government. I think those are the 4 scenarios, and that's backed up by the employee guarantee that we've seen recently. Now, for senior staff, it's a slightly different equation, which is partly, I think, what you were talking about. We haven't seen any drift, really, because we've actively moved people in interim arrangements into roles that are supporting the development agenda. So all our collaboratives are supported by key senior people from different sectors and from commissioners as well as providers. On the ICS, 2 of our accountable officers are interim strategic partnership leaders for those two wings of the ICS that I was talking about. So I think there are things that you can do to mitigate some of those demotivating factors that are inevitably there when people are anxious. Back to you, Miriam.
Thanks, Stephen. Angela, did you want to give us some thoughts on that one as well?
Yes, thanks, Miriam. Yeah, we haven't seen the drift, but understand the question, the concern. I think the examples that I've been party to, whether it's the collaboratives locally or the group model that we've emerged across the two trusts, I think it's given people stretch opportunities. So people who were naturally, perhaps we might have lost, have actually took opportunities. So I think it's been a positive experience so far, and I probably wouldn't have kept those people without some of that. And then on the ratings and people's, if you like, sort of inward view, just to say in terms of my context, in Northamptonshire, I was an outstanding trust. I took on Leicestershire, which requires improvement and inadequate for well led. It's still in that place because we've obviously got inspections. In fact, we're in the middle of one. But I've absolutely pushed us hard to do the partnership working as we've described. And during COVID, we've emerged a group, we've emerged a collaborative. We've took on the leadership for learning disabilities in Leicestershire, and we're in an East Midlands collaborative, because actually that is the only way to be able to deliver the high quality care and to be, a strong partner to deliver outcomes. So I don't think there's a choice about that personally.
Thanks, Angela. And we are sadly colleagues at time, because we were only due to run till 1:45. So I'm going to take a moment just to say a huge thank you to our speaker panel and to all of you actually for the really good questions that you've posed. Really deep and rich presentations, which we could have explored in much greater depth, but we wanted to give you a packed agenda with lots to get your teeth into, and we've certainly achieved that. So I hope you found it as useful as I have. Very brief takeaways from me. I think it's super impressive what you've all achieved in terms of leadership in your respective systems. Really, really impressive and motivational. Really struck by how enmeshed sort of place and provider collab arrangements really are, and that's something we'll take away, I think, in NHSP and think about a little bit more, because national policymakers love to put things in boxes, and that's not how real life is, of course. Really motivated by being driven by service users and building out from that, sort of holding that ambiguity for people and accepting it's a journey and a mindset shift, which is going to take time in some places, and by the conversations that we've just had around supporting staff. And starting small and building up was my other takeaway. So really fantastic session. Thank you so much all for attending. Please do look out if you're interested for our next two webinars on similar topics. So we've one on the 6th of July in partnership with NHS Clinical Commissioners. That's looking at the sort of link between strategic commissioning and provider collabs. And we've another on the 22nd of July, looking at how form follows function, something that a number of you commented on. And as I said, this is very much the start of a bigger programme of support that NHS Providers is developing with your help. So please do your evaluation form when it comes around, and just drop us a line if you've got any hints or tips as to what would support you most in this regard. So thanks again, and thanks again to our speakers, and we'll see you all again soon.